Hi, I'm Emily, and today I'll show you how I made my latest historical dress based on this real pattern from 1918. This is a pattern from Vintage Pattern Lending Library on Etsy. And contrary to what their name would lead you to believe, you do actually have to buy the patterns. But this particular pattern is from 1918, and it's a pattern for a lady's one-piece apron dress. So I think this is sort of equivalent to like a casual house dress that you might wear during the day, maybe while you're cleaning, maybe to receive visitors in the home. But it's intended, I think, and all of this is sort of like my own personal assumptions based on how simple the pattern is. But I think it's intended for a home sewist, probably not supposed to be the most fancy type of garment. But you can see from the cutting layout that has been provided that it really is intended to be sort of cut all in one with the front and the back piece laying over the head and then stitching the side seams up. And so I think that's where the name apron comes from, because it sort of is like an apron that you would just slip on over your head. That means that there's going to be very little shaping in the actual garment, which, come to find out later, we're going to have to make some adjustments to get it to look more like the pattern cover art. So I now have the front, the back, the pockets, and the arm cuffs cut out. And the changes that I made to the pattern were to shorten the front and the back by about 8 inches or so. And then I also added a seam along the top of the shoulder. This pattern is really unique in that it was meant to be cut all in one, but I wanted my stripes to run vertically and they were running horizontally on my fabric, so that meant that I had to add in a shoulder seam to get it to fit. This is definitely one of those times where being short comes in handy, because if I was taller, I wouldn't have been able to do this on my fabric and still have the dress be ankle length. And then the only other change that I made was I scaled the pocket too. So I took about 2 inches out of the vertical length of the pocket to just kind of scale it proportionally to my size. To help the pockets stand out from the rest of the dress and provide some contrast, I decided to use some leftover pink fabric that I had from when I made a 1920s era blouse to make some custom piping. So I have some cord that I'm just going to take these bias strips of this pink fabric and sort of wrap the strip of fabric around the cord and sew it up to create my own piping to use as a decorative trim. With this piping, the distance from your stitch line to the edge of your fabric should be the same as your seam allowance. So after I was done making the piping, I sort of trimmed it down to the width of my seam allowance, and that way I could just line up the edge of my piping on the right side of my pocket fabric to the edge of that fabric and stitch it down. So it makes it really easy to apply in that manner. I am making each pocket out of 2 layers of fashion fabric for some added stiffness and durability. So I lay the second layer down on top and pin it in place. And then when I go to sew it, I actually flipped it over to the other side so that it would be really easy to just follow my previous stitch line from when I sewed the piping down. Then I clipped into the curves and turned the pocket right side out, using my hands and fingers to sort of press out the fabric around the piping edge, and having the piping there made it really much easier than normal to do that. And the other thing to note with these pockets is that the side edge remains completely unstitched, and that's because later it will actually get stitched down directly into the side seam of the dress. Next, I sewed up the shoulder seams using a French seam to do this so that there wouldn't be any raw edges on the inside of the dress. Then I came to the first tricky bit of this project, which was deciding where to place those pockets, because I have to make that decision before sewing up the side seams, But without having sewn up the side seams, it was really hard to get an idea of the overall shape of the dress. So I sort of pinned it on, tried it on in front of the mirror several times until I came to my best guesstimation of where the pockets should sit. Cross my fingers, hope for the best. Except I actually decided that I couldn't get a good enough idea of what it was going to look like without sewing up the side seams and seeing how having the arms sewed up was going to affect the way the dress draped. So I stitched the dress up down the side seams without the pockets so that I could then pin the pockets in place and hopefully make a better decision about where they should go. But I kept the dress open, sort of like from the waist down, so that I wouldn't have to redo the stitching there. But I was hoping that just having those like arms stitched up would give me a little bit better idea. And I'm not sure how much this actually made a difference. If I was going to do this again, I'm not sure I would go to the trouble of doing this step. For better or for worse, a decision had to be made, and once it was, I sewed the pockets down in place by just stitching in the ditch between that piping and the rest of the pocket fabric. And again, here's where having that piping really made this a lot easier because it was so easy to just be able to stitch right down in that ditch and have all the stitching line up nicely. Another thing to note here is that only the bottom edge and half of the side edge of that pocket get stitched down because the front of it needs to be left open so that you can get your hand in and so that it's a pocket. And then those long sort of flap things also need to remain loose because they will get folded over and have the belt put through them in the end. So with the pockets sewn in place, then I can do right sides to right sides of the front and the back of the garment and stitch up the remainder of the side seams. The next step is to attach the cuffs to the sleeves. So the cuffs themselves are really simple, just tubes of fabric. And then I sewed a row of stitches around the sleeves to gather up that fabric. And if you have watched my channel for a while, you know that gathering is one of my least favorite things in sewing. So yay for me, yay for this pattern. But I did eventually get the sleeves gathered and get the gathers distributed appropriately around the cuff, and then I was able to stitch the cuff down. Well, nothing is ever easy, my friends. Let me show you what I've done. I made the collar too small because this collar is cut on the fold, and I forgot that I added width to the dress also at the fold. So now my collar is not long enough and I have to decide what I want to do. The dress is pretty big on me, so I might actually just like put a tuck in the front all the way down and have that take up the extra so I don't have to cut a new collar. I might pin that and try the dress on and see if it still fits. Of course, I could just cut a new collar, adding on the extra, but I don't want to have to do that. So I think I'm going to see if this tuck situation in the front will even work. Okay, after all of that thought, I realized that I actually did not do this incorrectly. There is meant to be an opening in the center front, so all I really need to do is cut a slit and add a facing with a closure. So that's great, but what's not great is the fact that with this white collar and white belt, even though this was a common color scheme for this time period, I just feel like it's giving pilgrim. Like it's giving like elementary school pilgrim play vibes. So I decided to redo the collar and redo the belt in the striped fabric, and to give it a little bit of visual interest, I decided to make the stripes on the fabric go the opposite direction to the body of the dress. But it turns out that nothing in sewing is ever easy. I have managed to mess up this collar, and let me show you how I did that. So the closure sits like this, one side over the other. But when I do that, now the collars are like overlapping when they should just be meeting in the center. So what I really need is for my collar to end like there on that side, and for it to end there on that side. So I need to make this collar slightly shorter, which is my fault because I lengthened the collar because when I was looking at this pattern, like I thought it didn't go far enough. Turns out it did. They did in fact know what they were doing. The other thing about this collar is I forgot that I was going to add a layer of silk organza to the inside of this to make it a little more stiff and help it to stand up. So since I have to redo this anyways, I think I am going to add that layer of organza to the inside. But yeah, now we get to seam rip. Wouldn't be a sewing project without seam ripping. So the collar is redone and on. It's got the organza on the inside, so it's got a little bit more body. Honestly, still not as much as I think would be best. But at this point, it is what it is. It'll be fine. And I also added the piping, which I think is a nice touch, especially since the pockets have the piping. And I have to decide, I haven't done the belt yet. You know, I think I'm probably going to add piping to the belt too, just for consistency's sake. I'm waiting on buttons to come in before I add them, and I don't know, I might do a snap closure and just have the buttons be decorative, just because I've never done buttonholes before and I'm very nervous to do them, which is why I've never done them. It's like, after putting this much work in to the garment, do I really have the courage to do buttonholes? I don't know. And then the other thing that I'm going to do next is I'm going to redo the sleeves. Like, I want to make this a little bit narrower, and it needs to be tighter. It's too loose and it looks weird. So that is next. So I made the belt using the same method that I had used on the pockets, except this time I also added the silk organza inner lining to it. And then the only other thing that I did was I added buttons to the closure. I did not do the buttonhole method. I did the snaps with just decorative buttons on the top. And then the very last thing that I decided I needed to do before I could call this project done was to make an adjustment to the shape of the skirt. Because when I tried this on, it really was a full skirt and much more bell-shaped than what I was looking for, that slim 1910 silhouette that you can see in the cover art. So to do this, I basically just narrowed in the stitch line on the skirt, kind of like tapering it down from the hips on both sides, just narrowing the skirt out to be more of a straight up and down skirt. And this really is something that I've found with a lot of these vintage patterns that I've used, where the pattern cover art kind of shows one thing, and then you can't really trust that the end pattern is going to look exactly like the art, because after all, it's a drawing and it's an interpretation of the project. So unlike, modern patterns, which actually they've made up the garment and then you can see someone wearing it, sometimes with vintage patterns, it's like the drawing will be very stylish, super like following the silhouette of the day, but then the patterns somehow, maybe because they're geared towards home sewists and it's made to be a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to follow. Like the pattern just doesn't quite get you all the way there in terms of the silhouette. But with that adjustment made, I was very happy with the fit, and now it's time for the reveal.